Hello students! Today we will be going over the evidence-based reading test portion of the new SAT. Now for those of you that have studied the old SAT, there are some tiny differences between the new and the old version of this section. Primarily, the first one people usually notice is a vocabulary section. In the old SAT, the vocabulary section is usually first, very distinct, very independent set of 6 or 7 questions. Now in the new SAT, it's more integrated into the passage. For example, there are more of taking a word from a reading than explaining it. Now a second difference is that there tends to be more variety of texts in the new SAT. For example, you will tend to get more mathematical, scientific, or even magazine questions, whereas in the old SAT, you will usually get literature or just history. And then the third major difference is that there are new question type. The new question type is what I call the why choose this kind of question. You have question 1, it asks you to choose A, B, C, and D. After you choose it, there's a second question that asks you why do you have to choose A, B, C, and D. Now all of these differences between the old and the new is not more confusing in general. It usually makes it a little bit easier for you to split up the test and do them in little sections so that you do not mix up with too many of them at the same time. Having said that, there will be 4 single passages, 1 page long per passage, 500 to maybe 750 words of that sort. And then they usually have a couple questions following them. And then there's also 1 pair of dual passages that can ask you to compare and contrast between the 2 passages. So 5 sections in total, each one have around 10 questions if you divide it up evenly. The main problem most of us will encounter when doing this section is timing, because as it says, there are 52 questions in total and you only get a little over an hour to do all of these questions. That means you have 1 minute per question and you probably have to devote 30 to 40 seconds of that 1 minute to reading the passage. This is why we are going to go over some of the strategies that will help you go through these texts a little bit faster. Save you some time so you can do the easy questions with good accuracy and then go on to the harder questions, spend more time on them, and also get them right. The goal here is to get as close to a perfect score as possible. Having said that, we'll now go to the actual tactics that will help you achieve these goals. Now, the first tactic that this book presents, and also I think is a very good one, is before every single passage, there will be a little introduction text, 1 sentence or 2 long. It will tell you where the text is from, what type of text it is you can usually infer from the first passage. And the general usefulness of these is that read these first so you can get a main idea of what the passage might be about. For example, this is a history passage. It'll probably be facts-based, or it'll be a literature passage. It'll probably be theme-based, or it can even be a scientific passage in which it may be trying to convince you or provide evidence for something. Having that kept in your mind, it will be a lot easier for you to get a main idea as you're reading the whole passage. Now the second tactic is in the new SAT, especially in this section, a lot of the questions will have numbers in them. For example, from lines 5 to 8, what does the author mean? Now, as soon as you see these numbers, especially the line numbers, go back, get a pencil, put a star, put a bracket, put a dash next to the lines that they encounter, so that when you do have to go back and read the entire passage, you can focus especially hard on these specific lines so that you do not have to go back and read it a second time, for example. You can read it first time through and you will pay special attention to these lines so you get a good idea the very first time. Saves you a lot of time. It's a great tip. Tactic 3 is that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, there are many varieties of texts. So sometimes for example, if in a scientific passage, they're talking about Cnidarius, which is kind of like a seashell, you will want, and then if you do not know anything about that passage at all, there's too many scientific words, you're overwhelmed, you have no idea what to do. What you should do in that case is skip the entire passage, go to the next one. Because the same amount of time you spent on the text that you are unfamiliar with, for example, 20 minutes, you can probably spend that time on a passage that you are more familiar with, for example, literature, in 10 minutes and get the same amount of points. As I said, we are trying to get a perfect score here, but when you do not have enough time, it's safer to just go with passages you're familiar with and then come back to these unfamiliar passages. Saves you a bit of time, and maybe if you do happen to run out of time, it will get you the most points possible. So to recap, if you meet a passage that you are completely unfamiliar with, skip it and come back to it later. Now the fourth tip is that once you do decide to not skip a passage, or once you do decide to do a whole entire passage, do every single question in that passage first before moving on. Now, what I used to do a while ago is I will read a passage and then maybe there are 1 or 2 questions I don't know, so I'll skip it and come back to it maybe 30 minutes after. But then what happens usually if you do that is that you come back 30 minutes after, you forget what the passage is about. And then you have to go read it again to answer these difficult questions. Now, why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense. So what I learned to do and what you should probably do and not make the same mistake is read a passage, answer all of the questions, every single one of them, before you move on. Even if you do not know a question, you will not know the question better if you skip it and come back to it 30 minutes later. So after you read the question, after you read the passage, it really is the best time to answer all the questions, regardless of your familiarity. So again, to recap, answer every single question on one passage before you begin to move on. The next tip that I find usually pretty useful is Tactic 6. If you look on page 118 of this particular book I'm using, they give you 8 different types of questions. I think that's very unrealistic. You do not have enough time to be thinking about the individual question types as you're doing them. What I usually do is split all the questions into 2 categories. Very easy to recognize. One category is a specific line number questions, and the other category is what I call the main idea questions. What are the differences? The specific line questions is usually when they say in paragraph 2, in lines 5, in lines 6 through 7, something like that. They give you a very specific section that you could get a pencil and mark down which section you need to focus on. And then the main idea questions are the questions that they ask you, what is the purpose of the author? What is their viewpoints? Things that you have to read the entire passage for before you answer them. Now, why would you split these questions into 2 types? Well, when you read a passage and read the questions that corresponds to the passage and locate the specific line questions, you answer these questions first. You go back to the passage, do not even read the whole thing. Just go to the specific lines that the questions ask for, answer them in detail, and then you read the whole passage and do the main idea questions. This way is essentially reading the first time very carefully and then reading the second time with the main idea, so that you do get the best idea of what each question is about, and you do get the best idea of what the whole passage is about without reading the whole thing 3 or 4 times. So again, split all the questions into main idea questions, split them into the specific line questions, answer the specific lines first, and then do the main ideas. We will go over this strategy in detail a little bit later if it sounds a little bit confusing now. Now the next tactic that I would like to go over is about the main idea questions. Often on the evidence-based reading sections, the most difficult questions would be, what is the main idea? Questions like this. And sometimes a passage can be confusing, especially because they give you such a tiny segment from the whole book, it's hard to make out what the author is trying to say. But a very good tip to use is that when authors usually write, they put the main idea in the first or last sentence of a particular paragraph or a little section. Once you identify the section, go to the first or go to the last sentence, and just read these. And usually the answer will be one of these sentences, or at least a similar idea to one of these sentences. Just keep that in mind. We will go over this a little bit later as we actually do the questions and practice. Now the next tactic that we will go over would be the implication question, would be the inference questions. Now you will see these questions will be, for example, what does the author imply in lines 10 through 12? When they say that, they will always have 1 or 2 trick answers in the choices that may seem very, very apparent if you are not well versed in how to solve and look through these question types. When the SAT asks you to make an inference, when it has a word implying it or something of a similar sort, it means do not pick what it literally says. All right? If the sentence they ask you to infer from says the curtain is blue, do not pick choice B that says the author means that the curtain is blue. Pick a choice that has a similar meaning that you have to dig a little bit in depth with. For example, if the sentence says the curtain is blue, maybe the answer will be, oh, the author trying to imply or inference that the day is a very sad day, that they're feeling down, something of the sort, all right? So again, as we'll practice this later, but in layman terms, when the SAT asks you to imply, do not pick the obvious, literal answer. Pick the answer that needs a little bit of thinking. And once you get that tip in, it'll help you avoid some of the easy mistakes and get you that bonus 30, 40 points. All right. The next tactic that is a little bit, you could use it if you want, you not use it if you don't want to, is look for keywords in the question type. All right. For example, when the question asks you about the attitude, what is the attitude of the author? What is the mood? What is the tone of the passage? You might want to go back and locate the specific words that convey tone, attitude, or mood. For example, angry, easy. That's an easy one that says maybe the attitude is that the author is feeling stressful or something like that. On page 128, they give you a long list of maybe 30 words or 20-something words that often conveys attitude and tone. For those of you that know English pretty well and read a lot, these shouldn't be that much of a challenge for you. For those of you that do not know English that well, you'll most likely go through these words when you're reviewing for the vocabulary section anyhow, so don't worry too much about it. If you got the vocabulary section taken care of, this will not be a problem for you. So use this tip of looking for tonal words or attitude words if you want, but in most cases, what I tend to do and what I think most people would do to save a little bit of time, just read it. Just know these words before you go in, so that when you read it, you will get a head start and then get a main idea before you have to go and locate the specific words. Vocabulary is king, of course. Tactic 12 is that, or tactic 12 in this book, and what most of you probably should make use in the vocabulary sections, is context clue. Now, as I mentioned earlier, unlike the old SAT, this SAT integrates the vocabulary sections into the passages. What it means is that instead of one sentence, you will have a paragraph. You will have a whole passage to figure out what it usually means if you want to. So use context, especially use that one sentence that the word is usually from. And what I usually do in these sections, and what I found out with students is a great success, is use this 3-step strategy when it comes to the vocabulary. Use context, read the original sentence that the word is in, think about what it means, come up with your own original definition of what that sentence means, all right? And then take that specific word. Step 2 is take that specific word, come up with your own synonym. For example, if the word is angry, come up with a synonym that may be bombastic or frustrated or mad, and then that will be your synonym. And after you come up with a synonym, go through your choices, A, B, C, and D, and see if the word matches to your original word and to the synonym. And if it does, then plug it in and see if it matches to your original sentence, original definition as we came up with in step 1. So 3 steps we will go over a little bit later in the text. Actually, we'll go over it a lot and we'll practice over a lot. So don't worry too much about it. The last tactic is that, as we mentioned earlier, there will be a pair of comparative segments or comparative passages that they will give you to answer. It may be a little bit confusing, and if you do not know how to tackle these, you will be wasting a lot of time. So what you should do is read each passage. For example, passage 1, read it, answer all the specific questions about passage 1 first, and then read passage 2, answer all the specific questions about passage 2, and then answer the questions that ask you to compare and contrast. This way you save a bit of time. You only read each passage once or twice if you really have to, and you get to answer all the questions with the greatest accuracy, because again, if you read each passage individually, you do not get the context, you do not get the authors mixed up. So it'll be fresh in your mind, compartmentalized, and it's easy to compare at the end, because after you answer all the specific questions, you should have a better idea of what each passage is about. So again, when we deal with pair passages, as they said, do them one at a time, and then do the comparative ones at the end. Saves a bit of time, makes it a little bit less confusing, all right? Oh, there is one final tip that I forgot to mention, is that sometimes they ask you about graphs, because in the old because in the new SAT, one of the main things is that you will want to look at in the new SAT, they will sometimes give you graphs and charts. And when they ask you to deal with the graphs and charts in these passages with a specific question, only look at the graphs and the charts. Do not read the whole entire passage. They want to confuse you, but only look at the graphs and charts. We'll go over this a little bit later. There's usually not too many questions, so it'll be fine. Thank you, and hopefully you can remember all these texts. If not, go over it again, and we will practice a little bit later.